scrupulous, principled, dutiful.
My whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service.
If she's an ancient oak tree, the sense of duty is the heart wood.
But what really influenced this lifelong sense of duty?
The abdication of her uncle Edward VIII rocked the monarchy in a very profound way.
The fallout from her uncle's historic decision to put love before duty was the pivotal moment in Elizabeth's early life. It would define how she would behave throughout her reign.
The Queen had a job to do, the job had to be done. Everything else had to fall by the wayside.
From tensions over her sister Margaret's forbidden love,
you could see Margaret's body language. There was almost a sort of accusatory look, a glance of resentment.
to ordering the end of Prince Charles and Princess Diana's hostile marriage.
The Queen said it was in the country's interest that there should be a divorce.
To the ultimatum she gave her favourite grandson.
If you want to go, you have to go so that you don't bring the institution of monarchy into disrepute.
Tonight, Royal Insiders reveal the remarkable story of how one event influenced the Queen's whole outlook on life, and even brought her into conflict with her subjects.
She was acting as a grandmother, protecting her grandsons who had just lost their mother.
What I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart.
She was criticised because it looked as though they didn't care.
The Queen is a wife, a sister, a mother and a grandmother. But above all, she's a monarch, and with all the responsibilities that carries.
She sees her role as handing on the monarchy to the next generation in a better condition from that in which she found it.
The Queen is admired across Britain and all over the Commonwealth for her lifelong commitment to the crown.
My lords, pray be seated.
To really understand how the Queen developed her sense of duty, there's one moment in her young life that it all dates back to, when her uncle, King Edward VIII, abandoned his country and his duty to pursue romance.
If you just look at King Edward VIII, he actually chose, in one sense, family over duty. He chose Wallis Simpson. I think that that was just shocking to many, many people across the country.
The monarch is anointed by God. They vow that they will serve the country for their life. And Edward VIII didn't do that.
The abdication changed everything for the young Elizabeth. Her life, her future, and her outlook. Edward and Mrs. Simpson were exiled to France as the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, while Elizabeth's father was crowned king in his brother's place.
I could show you photographs of the Duke of Windsor, aged 70. I've never seen a man with such sad eyes, somebody who basically had betrayed his birthright, and that's something she was never going to do.
He believed that individual fulfillment and personal happiness was actually an adequate goal. I think Elizabeth grew up learning that that was not an adequate goal.
And her mother never forgave Edward. And I think what she thought would have very much influenced what Elizabeth, growing up as a little girl, would have thought.
The abdication crisis very nearly toppled the crown, and the drama has lived long in Elizabeth's memory. She was homeschooled alongside her sister Margaret, with ideas of duty and service.
The sort of most significant teaching, in a sense, was learning by example, watching her grandparents and then her parents in performing their royal duties.
Elizabeth inherited a seriousness of purpose from her father based on the fact that he was aware that some royals don't behave very well.
Nothing sums up Elizabeth's sense of duty more than the speech she gave at 21, 5 years before she became Queen. Still resonant today, it sets out how she would reign for years to come.
This is a happy day for me, but it is also one that brings serious thoughts.
It's the words of a 21-year-old who clearly was already feeling the weight of responsibility that had fallen on her as now the heir to the throne.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
We don't have an imperial family anymore, but we do have a Commonwealth family, and she has dedicated herself not just to the United Kingdom as part of the Commonwealth, but all the other 53 nations who make up the Commonwealth family.
And I think that really was the leitmotif for everything she's done ever since.
It is surely a great joy to us all to think that we shall be able to take some of the burden off the shoulders of our elders who have fought and worked and suffered to protect our childhood.
By the late 1940s, only a few years after this speech, Elizabeth was taking the burden of duty from her father's shoulders. As his health declined, he coached her so that she could take his place.
I think there's no question that she knew her father was very ill.
The King's illness preventing him from attending this celebration of his birthday, Princess Elizabeth took his place.
She famously took the Trooping the Colour ceremony for him in 1951. And then she went on a long overseas trip to Africa, during which he actually died.
Touring Kenya in her father's place, Elizabeth had to put aside her grief. Now Queen at the age of 25, it was her duty to be strong for her country, a duty instilled in her since the abdication that would guide her on her journey as monarch.
The sentiment had to take second place, but that doesn't mean that duty was overriding any feelings Elizabeth had for her father. He would have been gratified that she was doing this. It would have been more upsetting for the ailing king if Elizabeth had said, "Oh, I need to be here because you're so ill."
At her coronation in 1953, the Queen took sacred vows to govern her people and maintain the doctrine of the Church of England.
The promise is sealed at a faldstool before the altar. The Queen kisses the book and signs the form of oath.
The first test of this oath came more quickly than anyone could have imagined, and it came from within her own family. Her sister Margaret had fallen in love with a divorced RAF officer, Group Captain Peter Townsend.
The first problem that was personal as well as constitutional was when her sister Margaret fell in love with her father's equerry, Peter Townsend, and wanted to marry him.
In 1953, the Church of England did not allow divorcees to remarry. As Supreme Governor of the Church, the Queen was expected to put duty first and tell her sister to break off her love affair.
I think there's a real sense that she was torn here. She had every desire to give Margaret what she wanted. Princess Margaret at the time was under 25, but the sovereign had to give permission for her to marry.
Margaret waited 2 years until she was old enough to marry without the Queen's consent. But the Church still disapproved of divorcees. So the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, devised a plan, approved by the Queen, to let Margaret achieve her desires. But there was a catch.
Margaret could marry Peter Townsend, and she could keep her title, but her children could not be heirs to the throne.
Anthony Eden at the time said, I'm paraphrasing now, but he said, the Queen wouldn't want to stand in the way of her sister's happiness. If you think about that phrase carefully, she was saying, I'm not going to promote this thing which could be very damaging.
Princess Margaret's personal message issued from Clarence House began with these words. I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend.
For years afterwards, this courtier told me, when the family were together, there was almost a sort of accusatory look, a glance of resentment.
It was clear that Elizabeth would stick with her coronation oath and her 21st birthday vows to put duty first, whatever the collateral damage to her family. In the following decades, almost all of them would challenge her scrupulous outlook, and none more so than her favourite son, Prince Andrew.
And that was where Queen Elizabeth didn't think first of her duty. She thought first, this is my son, and it was a mistake.
years before she became Queen, Elizabeth had married Prince Philip. They had met for the first time when Elizabeth was 8 years old.
I would think the early years of Elizabeth and Philip's marriage must have been quite difficult. After she became Queen, he, who had had a very successful, promising naval career, had to give it up in order to walk 2 steps behind his wife for the rest of his life.
5 years her senior, Prince Philip was respected for his brave wartime service, and by the early 1950s was a high-ranking British naval commander. The couple had 2 children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne. But just as Elizabeth's life was transformed by her accession to the throne, so was Philip's. He was now her consort.
A lot of people have written and said over the years that the Queen and Prince Philip had been married, that there was a tremendous strain on the marriage. But Prince Philip was brought up royal. He knew exactly what he was marrying into. The Queen had a job to do, and the job had to be done, and everything else had to fall by the wayside.
They were obliged to give up their intimate family home at Kensington Palace to move into Buckingham Palace, and also give up Philip's family name of Mountbatten for their children.
Philip was not even allowed to give his children his own surname. So rather than becoming Mountbattens, they became Windsors. At one point he railed about it and he said, "I'm no more than a bloody amoeba."
So that caused a bit of tension in the household, and he felt rather diminished. Although in retrospect, arguably it's a rather feminist decision.
In an attempt to make a compromise with Prince Philip, the Queen agreed in 1960 that all their children would use the surname Mountbatten-Windsor.
An arrangement was made whereby male descendants who didn't have titles would take the name Mountbatten-Windsor. Now that was a sop to Philip to stop him feeling that, you know, he was just a spare part, as it were.
When the Queen and Prince Philip celebrated their golden anniversary in 1997, he made it clear how much impact the Queen's decision had had on their marriage.
Tolerance is the one essential ingredient of any happy marriage. It may not be quite so important when things are going well, but it is absolutely vital when things get difficult. And you can take it from me that the Queen has the quality of tolerance and abundance.
Prince Philip seems to have gone along with the Queen's schedule during their marriage. But what was the effect of her commitment to duty on her children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne? They were usually left at home when their parents went on tour.
On this, our first day in Nigeria, we are glad to be amongst the people of the capital.
During her first decade on the throne, the Queen and Prince Philip visited 32 countries, including 20 former outposts of the British Empire. The coronation tour of 1953 was the longest and kept the Queen away from her children for 6 months. A dutiful monarch, but a distant mother.
Charles and Princess Anne were very used to periods of absence from both their parents, and a sense that really they were being brought up by their nannies.
We have to look at it in context, because the English upper classes have always neglected their children. She probably made her biggest mistakes in terms of balancing a life of duty with a private life with her family. Unwittingly, I think.
There's an absolutely intriguing piece of news footage. The Queen comes off and she touches Prince Charles on the cheek.
On their return home, there was a delightful family reunion.
And it's absolutely tragic, this little child looking up at the grown-ups, whose hand is he going to hold? Now, I don't think too much should be read into a few minutes of a newsreel, but I think it's probably fair to say that the Queen was a detached mother.
By devoting herself to the service of the Commonwealth, the Queen was true to the words of her 21st birthday speech. But the effect on her children, especially Charles, was immense. In 1994, he revealed his feelings about his parents' remoteness in a controversial biography.
Well, the Prince of Wales was quoted as suggesting that his parents were cold and distant. I think he probably regrets having said that, because if you look at the relationship now, it's far from cold and distant.
Surprised by Prince Charles's comments, Princess Anne later leapt to their mother's defence.
Charles's sister said the opposite. That was nonsense to criticise their mother Elizabeth. But actually, the truth is, I think Anne is very much like her mother. They share an interest in horses. They never complain. They never explain.
Anne, of course, is more publicly protective of her mother, and a sense that her mother's always done the very best that she can.
12 years after Charles's criticisms were published, his thoughts about the Queen appeared to be more supportive when he paid an 80th birthday tribute to his mother.
For very nearly 60 of those 80 years, she has been my darling mamma. She has shown the most remarkable steadfastness and fortitude, always remaining a figure of reassuring calm and dependability.
It was a very heartwarming speech. It was almost a speech of reconciliation. He did say some pretty horrible things in 1994, but he's atoned. He's made up for it in 2006.
The Queen and Prince Philip had 2 more children in the 1960s, Prince Andrew and Prince Edward. By this point, she was 7 years into her reign, and with fewer overseas visits in her schedule, there was a little more time to invest in her family.
I think that there's a kind of second family feel to Edward and Andrew. So she's different, and I think there was a conscious effort and ability to spend more time with them.
Just as the Queen and Prince Philip had served in World War II, Prince Charles and Prince Andrew followed the royal tradition of pursuing a dutiful role in the armed forces.
Historically, the monarchy and the military have been very necessary bedfellows. The traditional role of a monarch was to be the defender of the realm, and was ultimately there to defend the country in battle, actively in battle, but also, of course, the monarch is head of the armed forces.
Prince Andrew was the only one of the Queen's children to serve in a time of conflict. In 1982, the UK went to war with Argentina over control of the Falkland Islands. Prince Andrew's ship, HMS Invincible, was deployed as part of the British task force sent to reclaim the islands from Argentine invaders. Margaret Thatcher's government wanted the prince out of harm's way, but the Queen thought it only right he should put his life on the line.
There are those who suggested, well, maybe he shouldn't be on that ship because he's the Queen's son. Now, the Queen would have been the first to say, he's in the Navy, he's been trained to do a job, he's been trained at taxpayers' expense to do a job, he stays in the Navy and he goes to do that job.
If the Queen had wrapped Andrew up in cotton wool and not allowed him to go to the Falklands, that would have been a terrible betrayal of her servicemen and women who were fighting in her name. So I think it was absolutely right that she allowed Andrew to go, and I'm sure he wanted to go.
The Argentine Navy was determined to either capture or kill the prince and destroy British morale.
General Galtieri at one point did actually say, send on the little prince, and of course if he'd been kidnapped or something like that, or indeed killed, the whole thing would have escalated a great deal more.
Ultimately, it was about duty, and it was about self-sacrifice, and that's absolutely at the heart of what she believes, both for herself but also for her family. And if that meant her son would be killed, then still that was the right thing to do.
Returning from the Falklands as a hero, Prince Andrew served another 2 decades in the Royal Navy before retiring and becoming a special trade envoy for Britain.
I am not getting any return for this. This is all done on behalf of the UK.
Andrew now earned the nickname Air Miles Andy and fostered deals and friendships with controversial businessmen. Believed to be the Queen's favourite son, Andrew was perhaps her one and only blind spot. And during the growing scandal of his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, maybe she made the wrong judgment call.
I think she felt, I certainly heard it said by people who know her, that she had overindulged him and therefore he got himself into this terrible situation where he appeared to be a close friend of a convicted sex offender.
The location of Prince Andrew's now infamous TV interview was Buckingham Palace.
Do you regret the whole friendship with Epstein?
Now, still not. And the reason being is that the people that I met and the opportunities that I was given to learn, either by him or because of him, were actually very useful.
The Queen would certainly have been closely involved with Andrew's plan to give that television interview. Otherwise, there's no way that Andrew would have been able to arrange the interview to take place in the palace.
Andrew is a grown man, and I'm sure he's a very compelling individual who I'm sure knows how to press his mother's buttons, just like, many other sons.
And that was where Queen Elizabeth didn't think first of her duty. She thought first, this is my son, he knows what he's doing, and it was a mistake.
Both mother and son appear to have made mistakes over Epstein, but despite the outcry over the interview, the Queen appeared in public to support her son.
The next day, the Queen was seen out riding with Andrew in Windsor Great Park. That said it all. He had become a liability, but he was still her son.
The Prince Andrew scandal isn't the first time the Queen's judgment has been called into question. In 1997, after Princess Diana's death, her instinct was to protect those closest to her, but she found herself in conflict with public opinion.
This was one of the few occasions when the Queen totally lost control of the situation. I mean, it was a disaster.
On the 29th of July 1981, the Queen watched her son Charles marry Diana Spencer in St. Paul's Cathedral.
Well, like any mother, I suspect that the Queen was very happy to see her son getting married, and it just so happened to be the heir apparent, which would have, of course, been a big relief.
But she would have been wary. She would have known that, to some extent, Charles was marrying Diana because his mother felt he needed to marry someone and have some children to carry on the line.
Despite Charles and Diana having only met 13 times, the Queen was adamant Diana was the perfect wife for the heir. But Charles's affection may have been elsewhere.
Well, of course, we know now that Prince Charles, he didn't get to marry the love of his life. It was frowned upon him wanting to marry Camilla. She wasn't right.
The Queen would have been aware, even on the very day that Charles married Diana, that there in the background was Camilla, with whom Charles had been intimate since the early 1970s. Elizabeth would have been anguished by this because she would have sensed that her son was doing something that was going to lead to disaster.
Yet again, the Queen's expectation that her family would abide by a life of duty would cause untold damage to those closest to her. And in 1992, that collateral damage was aired publicly when Diana chose to speak out.
She allowed Andrew Morton to write his book, Diana, Her True Story. She spoke into a tape recorder, and that book was utterly explosive. It talked about 3 people in the marriage. She talked about how cold the royal family had been.
She would have been astonished that this demure aristocratic girl had really basically thrown a bomb into the works. Not a spanner, but a bomb.
Shortly after, Charles and Diana's separation was announced. The Queen's position was conflicted. Her son was unhappy, but a divorced king would not have looked good for the royal family. Charles would be the first ever king to be divorced before reaching the throne.
I suppose, given the Queen's upbringing, she was born in 1926 when divorce was not acceptable, and certainly divorce was not acceptable in the royal family. You just got on with it. The public face was what mattered. And so when Diana comes to the Queen first of all and pours out her heart and says, you know, what on earth can I do? According to Diana, the Queen famously responded, I just don't know. I can't help you.
But in prioritising what she felt was for the good of the monarchy, did the Queen falter?
It should have been nipped in the bud a lot quicker and a lot sooner instead of left to Charles and Diana to try and sort it out, because the marriage had got to a stage where there was no way there was going to be reconciliation.
In 1994, Charles shocked the world. He confirmed in a television interview that he'd had an affair.
Did you try to be faithful and honourable to your wife when you took on the vow of marriage?
Yes, absolutely.
And you were?
Yes. Until it became irretrievably broken down.
The Queen must have been, in one sense, heartbroken. She could possibly be on the verge of losing the monarchy. Personal stuff is private. You have a duty to the country. And in one sense, Prince Charles has just broken all those rules.
A year later, Diana took an unprecedented step with that infamous tell-all interview that seriously called the monarchy into question.
Well, anything good I ever did, nobody ever said a thing. Never said well done or was it okay. But if I tripped up, which invariably I did, because I was new at the game, a ton of bricks came down on me.
The Panorama interview that Diana gave would have been seen by the Queen as an act of enormous betrayal. This was one of the few occasions when the Queen totally lost control of the situation. She would have been absolutely distraught at the risk to her position as monarch and to the reputation of the monarchy. I mean, it was a disaster.
This was breaking point for the Queen. In December 1995, 3 years after the separation, she wrote to Charles and Diana and instructed them to seek an early divorce for the sake of the country.
In the letter, the Queen said it was in the country's interest that there should be a divorce. But it's very unusual for her to intervene so decisively in a family matter.
This is exactly what the Queen did not want to happen. She saw it happen in her own family with her uncle, King Edward VIII. She then had to make a decision about her own sister. I think it would have been incredibly difficult for her to say, I'm giving my permission, because her whole life was trying to make sure that that didn't ever happen again.
On the 31st of August 1997, Princess Diana tragically died in Paris.
When Diana was killed in that car crash, in that terrible car crash, Prince Charles, with the two boys, William and Harry, were up at Balmoral, staying with the Queen and the rest of the royal family. The Queen felt, I think, very strongly that her place during that week between the death and the funeral was to be with her grieving grandchildren in Balmoral.
Of course, the Queen wasn't allowing for this extraordinary emotional outburst. And I think that's because the Queen was brought up not to allow emotions to dominate.
The Queen was basically doing not only actually her family duty, but also her royal duty, at least as far as she understood it from past precedent. And that was royals at a time of death should retreat into a period of mourning, of withdrawing from public life.
Her response caused outrage. In the week following Diana's death, she was criticised heavily for not returning to London, which had become the focal point for public grief.
This is the people's princess that has just lost her life tragically at such a young age. And we don't see the Queen. No one sees the Queen. And everybody's asking, where is the Queen when we need her in this time of anger and heartbreak?
The Queen had misread the emotional temperature, as it were, in the country. The only way to appease the crowd, as it were, would have been to have made a decision to come straight back to London.
The Queen was seriously condemned by the press and public when she decided to take William and Harry to church just hours after they'd received the news of their mother's death.
Diana died early on Sunday morning, and that morning at 11 o'clock, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh and other members of the family and William and Harry, they went to church. But they were criticised because it looked as though they didn't care. But that was not the case at all. They went to church because William specifically asked if he might, because he wanted to talk to Mummy.
There was further backlash that the flag at Buckingham Palace was not raised at half-mast.
The flag at Buckingham Palace was never raised when the Queen wasn't there, so, there was a fundamental misunderstanding of the Constitution.
The flag had never flown over Buckingham Palace before, at half-mast, not when her father died. So you could say, oh, she was a bit slow to break the protocol, but maybe she was busy looking after the kids.
It was a testing time. Her controversial decisions made the royal family extremely vulnerable.
I think that week after Diana's death was the most dangerous week that the Queen has had throughout her entire reign. People were angry. They were very angry. They had not seen a sign of grief from this cold, hard family that Diana had described to them.
It is a paradox that a queen who's often been criticised over her reign for not putting family first, the first time, or one of the very few times she tries to do it, she's criticised for that as well. So it really is true that she can't win.
I think possibly for the first time in her reign, that was a moment when the Queen was out of step with the country, where she was not putting duty first, not actually perhaps listening to her instincts as monarch. She was possibly listening to her instincts as a grandmother.
The Queen had acted on what she thought was right, but eventually realised her instincts had been wrong. She changed her plans and returned to flag at Buckingham Palace was flown at half-mast for the first time in history. And the Queen made arrangements for Diana to receive full royal honours at the funeral, despite her no longer being a member of the royal family. The Queen also made a rare televised address to the nation.
What I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being.
The day before Diana's funeral, the Queen returned, mingled with the crowds, and addressed the nation.
2 words where she said, speaking as a grandmother.
She doesn't like generally to stray into anything that suggests that kind of softer, more intimate, family-orientated side. She doesn't like to use that in her public pronouncements.
Suddenly, any ill feeling sort of fell away because people understood she had been acting with the best interests of the 2 young boys.
The anguish over Charles's love life did not end with the death of Diana.
It's believed, and there's some truth in it, that at a meeting at Sandringham, the Queen said to Charles that she wanted nothing to do with that wicked woman, and that was a reference to Camilla. I do know that the Queen, on that occasion, asked Charles if he would give up Camilla, and Charles answered that his relationship with Camilla was not negotiable.
Even 8 years after the death of Diana, and even though the Queen had finally accepted Charles was to marry again, she still chose not to attend her own son's wedding.
The Queen is head of church. So for her to be at a wedding of 2 people who have both been divorced, going into their second marriage, is not really what the Church of England stands for.
She wouldn't have said, oh, I've got to, hold my son's hand. She grew up not doing that kind of sentimental thing. I know I can't entirely approve of this, so I'll just take one step back. I'm very happy for my son to be happy, but I won't actually go.
The Queen wasn't willing to compromise her role as the head of the church, but the moral framework she'd always stuck to was changing all around her.
The change that has happened during the Queen's reign is just extraordinary. If you think that the reason she became Queen was because, her father became king, was because her uncle had wanted to marry a divorcee and was unable to. I mean, when she came to the throne, divorcees were not welcome at court. Divorcees were not admitted to the royal enclosure at Ascot. By the end of her reign, 3 of her 4 children are divorced. The world has moved on, and the church has moved on, and the Queen has moved on with them.
New challenges lay ahead, and this time it would be the next generation causing the problems.
The Queen would have been aware that this was a storm that, if it wasn't dealt with quickly, it could blow up into something really damaging.
In January 2020, the Queen faced an unprecedented challenge when her grandson Harry and his wife Meghan made a shocking announcement that they were quitting their roles as senior members of the royal family.
I remember having to stop the car that winter evening when I heard that they had decided to step aside from their royal duties and they hoped to collaborate with this extraordinary statement.
Not even the Queen had been informed of the decision ahead of the announcement on their Instagram page.
The palace let it be known that there was surprise that this statement had been issued. So I think the Queen, I suspect, was rather surprised to be given almost an ultimatum, a public ultimatum, that these are the terms, that we're going to be different sorts of royals, we're going to collaborate with the Queen, perhaps on our own terms.
The Queen clearly adores Harry, but absolutely refused to be pressurized by him. There was no way she would accept his conditions. She issued a firm riposte, setting out her own position.
And all of a sudden, the Queen shocked the world, coming out and saying, hold on a minute, this is complicated, nothing's been decided, and we need some time to figure it out.
Harry's announcement put his grandmother in a difficult position, and his timing could not have been worse.
She'd recently gone through the issue with Andrew. The Duke of Edinburgh had been extremely ill in hospital just before Christmas. So I think that for the 93-year-old Queen, this came at a very, very difficult time.
The Queen would have been aware that this was a storm that, if it wasn't dealt with quickly, it could blow up into something really damaging. And the Queen, with so many years of experience, realised that she had to intervene.
The Queen took control and called a meeting known as the Sandringham Summit, where she met with Charles, William and Harry to find a resolution.
The sort of granny effect didn't come in. She'll always be grandmother, and to Harry, she'll always be granny. But it had to be a business-like meeting because at the end of the day, it was discussing finance, how they're going to fund themselves, what's going to happen to Frogmore Cottage, are they going to carry on with the Commonwealth?
Her final proposition was ruthlessly clear. Harry and Meghan could be in or they could be out.
The Queen was all in favour of doing it in as low-key way as possible, being as sympathetic as possible, but understanding the difficulties that the British people can't be expected as taxpayers to pay for the redecoration of their wonderful cottage at Frogmore, and not to have them here performing duties. You can't be half in and half out.
Following the meeting, Harry shared his disappointment in a speech at a charity dinner.
Our hope was to continue serving the Queen, the Commonwealth and my military associations, but without public funding. Unfortunately, that wasn't possible.
Kind of the same thing that she tried to set out for Margaret was happening with Harry. Trying to make it work, but making sure that, you know, the royal law still stood tall.
She's seen it all before, is very understanding that if you want to go, you have to go so that you don't bring the monarchy into disrepute. The monarchy that she has spent her life trying to protect and build up.
Harry made his decision, and he opened up about how tough that had been.
The decision that I have made for my wife and I to step back is not one I made lightly. It was so many months of talks after so many years of challenges. And I know I haven't always gotten it right, but as far as this goes, there really was no other option.
From the Queen's next announcement, the tension between her roles was clear, but she stood firm.
She came out with that statement saying, yep, I support them. Pretty much I love my grandson Harry. I'm so proud of Meghan, but they will not be keeping their HRH titles and they will not be senior members of the royal family anymore and therefore will not be performing any duties under the Queen. And that was big.
The Queen's given up a lot. She's been given up a lot of what she might have wanted to do because of duty. She would have been very disappointed with Harry's decision.
Her grandson's decision to abandon his duty also echoed her uncle's painful abdication nearly 90 years before.
There's a tinge of Edward VIII and Wallace Simpson. I suspect that has definitely gone through the mind of Queen Elizabeth, thinking, oh my gosh, this is, how is this possibly happening again?
Yet again, the Queen showed that she was willing to set aside the interests of her closest and dearest, whatever the costs. She would once again stick to the commitment she made to the nation, aged just 21.
I think the Queen, for her, it would have been very, very sad. But at the end of the day, the second you start loosening up some of those roles and those ties and it gets a bit gray, she's probably thinking, you know, we could lose the monarchy.
After 68 years on the throne, her stance was clear.
Even if you're a favorite grandchild, the Queen is going to choose duty over family.
The Queen's life has been one long rebuttal to the abdication crisis. Again and again she's sacrificed those closest to her for what she feels is in the best interests of the monarchy. Now in her mid-90s, will she sit back and enjoy her final years, or keep on going as the full-time Queen of her nation?
There is much speculation that the Queen might one day have to abdicate. I think there is no chance of the Queen abdicating. As she said at 21, whether her life short or long, to remain committed to serving her people.
The story of Elizabeth II is a story of great sacrifice. A woman who dedicated herself at a very young age to duty, regardless of the consequences for her family and those around her.
The Queen will be very sensitive to all the personal costs that these crises have brought. She simply has a sense of duty needing to ultimately trump personal difficulty and personal emotion.
As we know, the nation adore the Queen, but so do her family. They're all very devoted to her. And so what more can be said? I think it's a success story.
To understand Elizabeth II, we must understand this unwavering commitment that separates her from her predecessors and makes her so special to us all. She has done what most cannot. She has put duty before family.